Welcome to Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White. We've just passed the 40th anniversary of the massacre at El Mozote, which took place in December of 1981 in northeastern El Salvador. I used to actually take students there for a number of years, and the last time was on the 30th anniversary. And so we haven't been back ever since then, mostly because of the escalating violence up in Morazan province. In any case, there were around 900 unarmed civilians that were murdered by the Salvadoran military, which was armed and trained by the U.S. at the time. And it still is, in fact. The 3 U.S. reporters who documented it at the time were denounced in the U.S. press, and the Reagan administration almost immediately certified that the Salvadoran military was in compliance with human rights standards, allowing for the release of another year's worth of U.S. weapons so they could essentially do the same thing afterwards. I used to take my students there, and we would find things like bone fragments, bomb craters, bullet holes, shell casings, shrapnel, and even clothing left behind from the mass murder. When you see a site like that and you read Mark Danner's book on the subject, or Dr. Chomsky's book, or her father's books on this as well, you can't help but wonder what kind of force could inflict such destruction on innocent people. It turns out it was the U.S. working with the Salvadoran government that made this happen. And we have to imagine what the results of something like this would be. Would the survivors just remain, or would they flee? And if they flee, where would they go? Some of my friends, and I know some of Dr. Chomsky's friends as well, who later joined the FMLN, some of them fled across the border to Colomoncagua, Honduras, and other refugee camps. There were many others that ended up fleeing to the United States, like some other friends of mine who live in LA, whose parents were murdered because they were part of the teachers union. And so all of these people are what we would call immigrants who were given a choice that was no choice at all. We love to talk about choice in the US. Well, is that the kind of choice we'd ever like to have? Would that kind of choice between death and immigration be something we would prefer others to have? People that are close to us, is that kind of choice we want them to have? I start with this because it shows how essential concrete knowledge is when we're discussing anything controversial. Platitudes about freedom and free will and choice are beautiful, but they also have political uses as well. So today's topic, immigration, is one of those most controversial ones that we have in our political, social, and cultural landscape. It splits Americans down the middle, but there's also a lot of range in between. Some believe in open borders, others believe in closed borders. And so when Donald Trump in 2015 announced his presidential campaign, he basically established a line and tapped into a narrative that American people knew quite well, which is that we should view Mexicans as criminals, essentially, that they're something to fear. And he needed a cause to rally for his cause and for his political campaign. But who knows if he really knew anything about the complexities of immigration. He might have believed, like many Americans, that there's a clear legal channel for everyone who wants to come here and that it's equally applied to everyone. Seems reasonable enough, but if you look at the actual history, this is an illusion. There's one group of Latin Americans who have been given somewhat special treatment, and that's Cubans. And a lot of them have been able to kind of shape the narrative because they say things like, well, I came here the right way, or my parents brought me here the right way, so why don't the Salvadorans and Mexicans, et cetera, do the same? And as our guest points out in her books on immigration, those fleeing the violence in their homelands or even seeking better jobs in the U.S. have long been condemned to come here illegally. The legal channels are literally closed to almost all of them. So that disparity of access matters, but it's not known to most Americans. And our guest today does an excellent job in her books to counter that narrative. Welcome, Dr. Chomsky.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So Professor Aviva Chomsky is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem State University. She has written a number of books on modern Latin America, from the Cuban Revolution to Central American history and Latin American immigration. So today I wanted to talk primarily about her book, Central America's Forgotten History, her latest book, but we can also draw upon her other works as well, including Undocumented and They Take Our Jobs, to name a couple of them. So I wanted to ask you first, how did you get interested in this topic?
That's a very long story.
Sure.
You want to hear it all?
Yeah.
So after my first year of college, I decided to take a kind of a late gap year it hadn't been named a gap year yet back in those days, but I felt like I needed to do something different and more meaningful. And I ended up volunteering for a year with the United Farm Workers. And I guess, to make the long story short, that's what got me interested in a lot of the issues that I've ended up dedicating my life to. Labor history, the history of commodities, the labor and exploitative relations that are embedded in commodities, the way racism works, immigration, anti-immigrant racism, the Spanish language. So I guess I would say that's where the seeds were planted. I also lived for several years in a house of Colombians in Barcelona. And that's where I really learned Spanish and also got connected to Latin America in a different way through exiles who had fled Colombia's violence and lack of opportunity to Spain or to Catalonia. And I ended up going back to, I went back to college and majored in Spanish and Portuguese. And then I was in school in Berkeley during the 1980s, which, of course, as you were telling us in your introduction, is when there were revolutions going on in Central America, a lot of refugees fleeing, a lot of them to the San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland, San Francisco. And Ronald Reagan was elected president and carried out a very aggressive U.S. policy towards Central America. And then the Nicaraguan Revolution also triumphed in 1979. So at the time that I went back into college with already fluent Spanish and doing my Spanish and Portuguese major, all of these political things were going on that really compelled me. So I got really involved in the solidarity movement and working with refugees and being able to make use of my Spanish skills that way. Working in healthcare issues and as a paralegal, helping people and learning about undocumentedness really for the first time. And then I decided I needed to go on and get a PhD in Latin American history because I was so shocked to discover the depths of my ignorance in terms of why all these things were happening and what the US role had been and what the history was. And I kind of discovered that a lot of what I had learned during the United Farm Workers really characterizes Latin American history and Central American history as well in terms of forced migrations and labor exploitation and racism, plantation agriculture, US investment, and political violence from above to maintain a very unequal system. So that's the short version of my long story.
It's very interesting. I was in the Bay Area in the same time in the 1980s in San Francisco, San Jose corridor, and met quite a few Salvadoran refugees at my high school. And I became a translator for them and learned some of their stories, but did not understand the political context as a high school student. This would have been 1991 by that time. And so then there's quite a bit of activism going on in the Bay Area at that time as well. Sister city programs and activism to try and stop the weapons from going down there as well. Like Brian Wilson wasn't that far away from there too, right?
Yeah, and I actually, when Brian Wilson was, the Concord Never Weapons Station was close, obviously, to where we were. And after his protest was violently taken over and he was run over by the train, there was a big protest a couple of days later that I was at. I still have one of the, I didn't participate in actually, I was actually pregnant at the time. I kind of stood on the sidelines, but people were literally tearing up the railroad lines, and somebody gave me a nail that I still hold as one of my most prized possessions.
Wow, that's something that really shocked me when I went to the Marines, and then I went to Humboldt State afterwards in the late 90s, early 2000s, and learning about all of this activism that was going on in the 1980s in the U.S. against U.S. foreign policy in Central America. It was something, it wasn't the same scale maybe as the anti-Vietnam War protests, but it was a lot of that. In some cases, there were that level of activism too, right?
And in some ways, I feel like it was deeper than the anti-Vietnam War activism, in the sense that so many ordinary people from the United States traveled to Central America, were connected through sister city programs, heard talks by Central American refugees. So many churches were, like, congregations were involved in solidarity work. In some ways, of course, the anti-Vietnam War movement, in terms of its mobilizing capacity, perhaps was greater, but in terms of the depths of solidarity, I think the proximity of Central America, the ability to actually connect with the revolutionary movements there, and the level of sympathy that is, a lot of people opposed the US involvement in Vietnam without having any strong ties or even political sympathy necessarily with the movements we were fighting in Vietnam. And I think that was stronger in Central America.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've oftentimes wondered about why it was, like you say, deeper, because the people were, they could actually travel down there too. And did you travel down there in the 80s and 90s?
Yes.
Yeah.
I spent time in Nicaragua during the revolution. Again, I'm like the cautious person, and I did not go to El Salvador or Guatemala during those years. And in fact, when I was getting ready to write my dissertation, I felt like the really brave and committed people in my program were working on El Salvador and Guatemala and planning to go down there and spend time. And I chose the easier way out by going to Nicaragua and Costa Rica. But I worked with a lot of Guatemalans and Salvadorans, and still do, because now in the area where I live, north of Boston, there's very large immigrant populations from Central America too. So a lot of my students are immigrants, and there's huge Guatemalan and Salvadoran communities, and Honduran now also.
Oh, sure, Hondurans, right. So but still being in Nicaragua during the Contra War must have been intense.
Yeah, I mean, I was primarily in Managua, not in the areas where the war was actually going on, but living in a revolutionary country was very intense anyway, even without being directly exposed to the war. Certainly the effects of the war in terms of its effects on the economy and on everybody, really, and the politics. So yeah, it was a really life-changing experience.
Can you tell our listeners who maybe aren't in the know about the significance of the Sandinista Revolution, what its role was in Central American and even US and world history?
Well, so the United States has considered Central America and the Caribbean its backyard, really, since the end of the 19th century, since the United States occupied the territory that it currently occupies. It started immediately, continued its expansion from the continent to overseas. So in 1898, of course, the United States takes Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and then quickly begins long-term military occupations in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, and in Nicaragua. And if not long-term military occupations, economic intervention and control, and periodic shorter interventions in places like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. So Nicaragua, of all of Central America, Nicaragua underwent the longest US occupation from 1912 until 1933. So the 2 full decades at the beginning of the 20th century. And that really shaped Nicaragua's development and Nicaragua's politics, obviously. And as in other countries that the United States occupied for long periods of time, one of the things that the United States wanted to do was to reform politics, and in particular the military, to promote US economic goals in the region and US economic control. So this meant creating a new National Guard, which they did in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, and in Nicaragua, and promoting loyal clients who would run the country. In the case of Nicaragua, it was Anastasio Somoza, who was head of the National Guard and whose dynasty, there were 3 of them, 2 long-term and 1 short-term, then ruled Nicaragua basically at US behest until the successful revolution of 1979. So what does it mean to run the country at the US behest? It means that it becomes more and more concentrated, and land and access to land for the poor, peasants, indigenous people has been a key issue in all of Central America's history. So the concentration of land in the hands of a few, and the reliance on U.S. investment and an export economy where Nicaragua's main products are exported to the United States, and U.S. companies control large sectors of the economy. So the Sandinista Revolution, which started coming together resistance movements. I mean, there was resistance to the U.S. occupation during the occupation, led by Augusto César Sandino, who the Sandinista movement of the 1960s was named after, guerrilla resistance that eventually was one of the main reasons that the United States was forced to leave Nicaragua, was the armed resistance ongoing to U.S. occupation. So the Sandinista movement of the 1960s, 1970s mobilized large sectors of the population against the dictatorship of the second Anastasio Somoza, the son of the original Anastasio Somoza, who became more and more corrupt and violent as his rule was threatened, and that succeeded in turning even larger sectors of the population against him. But the Sandinistas had a truly revolutionary project to transform the country and to mobilize the people in the interests of this transformation. And that was what was so amazing and dramatic about it. And like, I always think about it when I give political talks here and people say, well, what can we do? There's nothing we can do. It's, you know, the system is too big, too entrenched, too strong. I feel that way sometimes too. But I've just had so much experience where some of the poorest and most dispossessed people with the fewest resources on the planet have mobilized to bring about really dramatic social change. And they didn't stop and say, oh, well, it's too hard. We can't do it. We don't have the resources. They just did it and continue to do it, because where I work in Colombia now, too, I see the same thing happening. So the idea was to completely transform the economy by basically taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Turning the interests, the resources of the state over to creating a social welfare state, building an education system, building a healthcare system, and a major land reform, taking land from the large landowners and turning it over to state farms and peasant production. So, you know, that's kind of what I witnessed and experienced in the time that I was there, was this huge mobilization of the population with the belief that they could really remake their society into one based on social justice. So this also, of course, really inspired the revolutionary movements that were also ongoing in Guatemala and El Salvador. You remember the slogan, "Si Nicaragua venció, El Salvador vencerá." Since Nicaragua won their struggle, El Salvador will also win. But movements that had the same kind of vision, transformative and mobilizing vision for radical social change. And of course, the United States did not want to allow this to happen, especially because they were afraid it would spread and people taking their fate into their own hands and creating a different kind of economy and no longer serving the interests of US investors. You know, they reacted the same way they did to the Cuban Revolution, but actually worse, because the United States only invaded Cuba once in 1961 and they were kicked out. And since then, it's just been like political and economic punishment, but not actual military invasion. But in Central America, Ronald Reagan said, you know, we're drawing the line. We're not going to let any more of these revolutions happen. We're going to crush the Nicaraguan revolution and make sure that it doesn't succeed. No revolution can succeed in El Salvador and Guatemala.
I think the story you just told, too, is an example of several things that come to mind. First, it takes a while to even provide a nutshell history of the significance of a movement like the Sandinista Revolution. You could apply that to the Haitian Revolution or Cuban Revolution or whatever it might be. And so that's one of the limitations that Americans have that are addicted or mostly get their information from maybe social media now, but even in the past, just from television news, where they might get one glimpse every once in a while of a story. But on the other hand, it occurred to me right away that a lot of your inspiration, like mine and many others, actually comes from immigrants telling us about this. And that's such an important thing that we don't learn about when Donald Trump comes forward and talks about immigrants and denounces them, then that puts a wall up. But if you live in a place like in Massachusetts or in the Bay Area where there are these immigrants, you have to come into contact with these people. And if you open your heart up and listen for a few minutes, they'll just tell you this whole other world.
Which is maybe stories that our political leaders don't want us to hear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the situation in Nicaragua, for example, I grew up watching, things like about the hostages in Iran or about battles going on in the 80s, just little glimpses. You'd hear things like Managua or Granada or Leon mentioned every once in a while, but I didn't understand it until I met a fellow service member whose father was actually at the National Palace during the attack. And he remembers his father coming home with blood on his shirt. And he gave me Omar Cabezas' book, Fire from the Mountain. Mm-hmm. And he had a very balanced view of it, even though his family left as a result of the Sandinista Revolution there. He had a good balanced view of it. And it took talking to an immigrant for me to understand that and to have that book, which is a personalized account of the Sandinista Revolution. And then Tom Walker is a friend of mine. He lives just down the road as well. He's been retired for a number of years. But talking to people is such an important part of this. And if we don't talk, then we can't really learn anything.
Well, that's also why I decided I had to study history and hope that by teaching history, I can kind of get past. And yeah, it's not just social media. It's what you read every single day. I mean, I read social media, but I'm old. I still read a newspaper. But, the promotion of stereotypes and Cold War ideologies, it's all there, even in the liberal newspaper that I read, the Boston Globe. There's so many articles I just can't even bear to read because they're just repeating the same stereotypes and Cold War stereotypes. And I feel like my students don't even know that the Cold War ended because they learned about it. They didn't really learn that it ended, and they're still hearing about the evil communists everywhere out to get us. So why should they even think that it ever ended?
Or as you point out in your latest book, too, that people think about the Cold War as something that was kind of on like a hiatus war between the Soviets and the Americans, but really the fighting and the dying is taking place in the developing world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And in a massive way, too. You mentioned the line, Si Nicaragua venció, El Salvador vencerá. And the first time I heard that was from the band from Morazán, Los Torogoces de Morazán. And they have that song where they begin with that. I think it's called Todo Centroamérica. And it's all about, just the kind of revolutionary solidarity. And there's no mention of communism in there or the Cubans. In fact, they even say, no somos cubanos. We're not Cubans. We're Central Americans trying to change things. Not really even denouncing the United States and their music very much, just trying to say, let us live. And it shows the musical aspect, the cultural elements, like the Mejia Godoy brothers in Nicaragua too. Those are just examples of the multidimensional aspects of these revolutionary movements. They aren't spearheads of Moscow, right?
Yeah, I mean that's something that I think is really, really obvious the minute you set foot in Latin America. That everything you thought about the Cold War was wrong. And I mean, I even remember that feeling when I went to Cuba for the first time in 1994. And I thought, well, I know Central America had nothing to do with the USSR, but Cuba's different. Cuba really. And when I landed in Cuba and started getting to know, and I lived there for a semester, it's like, wow, Cuba's a Caribbean country. Like that, even with all my study, that hadn't broken through the Cold War imagery that I had built up on Cuba. Like here I am in the Caribbean. I am not in the Soviet Union.
Right. Expect to see Russian tanks or something like that. Well, of course, it's after that too, but maybe like a totalitarian dictatorship you don't see there. Yeah, Cuban culture is rich. The people are talking about other things, and very tied in also with U.S. Politics and culture. There's we just interviewed Ada Ferrer about her recent book on Cuba a couple hours ago. I had a great talk with her, but same kind of thing too. The perceptions are completely different than what you actually see there. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't understand too, is that even though there are 7 countries in Central America, when we think about the wars in Central America, we're really primarily, or wars and oppression, dictatorship, U.S. influence, we tend to focus on 3 or 4 different ones. Can you talk about why you chose to focus on those 4?
Well, so I chose to focus on Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And so Belize is a Central American country that was still a British colony at the time, and the United States doesn't really invade British colonies until after the British leave, like Grenada in 1983. But the United States doesn't like to take on powerful enemies. They only like to take on, weak, poor enemies that they believe they can crush easily. Only kidding. And Costa Rica, in many ways, had a different historical trajectory. And of course, Panama also had a very different historical trajectory from the rest of Central America. But so Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador is where the revolutions were taking place in the 1970s. And Honduras, although there was no revolutionary movement going on there, became kind of the unsinkable aircraft carrier for US policy. So basically all of Honduras was turned into a US military base. So from the perspective of the United States, and from the perspective of revolutionary movements for social change, those are the 4 countries that are kind of at the center of what's going on in Central America. That's where the United States is focusing its military, political, and economic involvement. Those are the countries that are in the news every day. And those are the countries where the real impact of both revolutions and counter-revolutions are being most strongly felt.
And do you think there are reasons, there's all kinds of political discussions or historical discussions about what makes those countries different than Costa Rica, for example. Costa Rica kind of stands out as this shining democracy in some ways versus a place like Nicaragua or Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras. Do you have an idea of your own as to why there's such a difference?
Yeah, I can point to a couple of historical factors that make them different. One is that going all the way back to the colonial period, Costa Rica lacked the 2 things that brought a lot of Spanish exploitation to other parts of Latin America. It lacked exploitable resources, and it lacked a large indigenous population. That meant that it's a little like New England in that way, with little in the term in easily exploitable resources for export, and no large imperial indigenous polities to take over and exploit for labor. So that means that Costa Rica remained much more lightly populated, and that the Spaniards who went there kind of had to farm for themselves because there wasn't much else they could do, as opposed to places where they were able to develop these extremely hierarchical, violent, and exploitative export economies. And you even see that difference if you look at the North versus the South of the United States. Where there was an exploitable resource for export is where the extreme inequalities and exploitation and forced labor systems are implemented. And where there's nothing to exploit, you can't really make a lot of money and bring in a lot of forced workers and exploit them. So, that's kind of a long-term difference in Costa Rica. And then in the 1950s, Costa Rica abolished its military. So, and one of the reasons it was able to do that was because the levels of inequality and exploitation were lower. So it didn't need the large military to continually be attacking its own population, because that's what Latin America's militaries have basically served for, has been to oppress and exploit their own populations. But where there's less inequality, less concentration of land, less forced labor system, you don't need as strong a military. So, but by abolishing its military, that allowed Costa Rica to devote its state resources towards building a social welfare state instead of just towards increasing its military. And we see this conflict going on in the United States right now. Can we have guns and butter? And if we can only have one, we know which one it's going to be. It's going to be guns, because they pass the military budget without a question. But when it comes to social welfare aspects of the budget, oh no, we can't afford that. In fact, Congress just passed more than Biden even asked for in next year's military budget. So, maintaining a huge military is a huge expense, and it drains state resources, and it entrenches the need for that military, because by taking resources away from the poor, it makes the poor more unhappy, and then you need more of the military to keep them down. And again, you can kind of see echoes of this happening in the United States too. So I would say that those are two sort of historical factors and moments that led Costa Rica on a different path. On the other hand, since the 1990s, Costa Rica has been just as Costa Rica's economy has been just as undermined by neoliberal reforms, and the social welfare state has really been put into a certain degree of tatters. So, of course, as a historian, I hate to try to predict the future, but in some ways, Costa Rica has become more Central Americanized in the last couple of decades.
I see. Yeah, last time I was there is in maybe 2003, but it is quite a distinct country. And the fact that you brought up Spanish colonialism is so important. I mean, we bring up Jamestown and Plymouth Rock here when we want to understand our own history, but the foundations, the economic and social foundations that followed Spanish colonialism did have an impact and continue to 5 centuries later.
So I really love Charles Bergquist's book, Labor in the Course of American Democracy, where he kind of compares the United States, North and South, to different parts of Latin America. And this is where he makes the argument that I was kind of summarizing about how where you have a lot of resources and you develop really exploitative labor systems, those anti-democratic structures are really durable. And where there's no resources and nobody to exploit, that's where democracy can flourish.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. And Bergquist also has a lot of work on Colombia, right?
Oh yeah.
Right. And so these economic foundations are really important for listeners to understand too, because they don't just go away. And a lot of the reforms that the Sandinistas were, I'm just generally referring to Sandinistas. Of course, there were a lot of different groups there, but what they're trying to undo is something what the FMLN was trying to do as well, which is kind of change the power structure, the economic structure, because from there you can have these social reforms. But if there's military actions that are being used against economic reforms over the course of centuries, really, then you kind of learn the lesson. You have to take up arms too. It's like that old saying, inevitable revolutions. The revolutions become inevitable. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about kind of going back maybe to the late 1800s in places like Guatemala and El Salvador, how some of those economic concentration changes might have affected what was going on during the Cold War?
So the late 1800s is the period that some historians refer to as the Second Conquest of Latin America. The first conquest was the conquest by the Spanish and Portuguese. And the Second Conquest comes after independence, and it's also known as the liberal era, the consolidation of the nation states after independence, but consolidation of dependent nation states. So they're politically independent, but economically dependent, especially on Northern European countries, England, Germany, and increasingly on the United States. And it's called the Second Conquest because there's a huge assault on indigenous lands in establishing these new dependencies and the development of new export economies. So if the colonial export economy was based on precious metals and sugar primarily, depending on what part of Latin America we're talking about. The Second Conquest is based on new export crops like coffee, especially in Central America. It's coffee. In other parts of Latin America, there are other metals that become important, like copper, fertilizers, like nitrites, guano, basically feeding the Industrial Revolution that's going on in Germany, United Kingdom, United States, and feeding the Industrial Revolution in two ways. Oh, the other Central American product is bananas. So feeding the Industrial Revolution with raw materials that the factories need. And this is also the period, if you remember, when the scramble for Africa is going on and the industrializing European countries are taking over the entire continent of Africa, again, in the search of raw materials for their industry and food products to feed their own populations who are no longer working on their farms because they are moving to the cities and starting to work in industry. So that there's a big transformation that's going on in Europe and the United States, from rural to urban and from independent artisan production to industrial production. So what are people eating when they stop working on the farms? And the farms are also mechanizing and industrializing, of course. What are people eating? Tropical stimulants. Coffee, tea, sugar, colonial products from the tropics, from these new colonies and neo-colonies. So this Second Conquest takes over huge amounts of Native American indigenous land. And of course, the United States is taking over indigenous land in the late 1800s as well, if you compare to what's going on in US history. And feeding its own industrial expansion domestically as well as globally, looking for outlets for capital, looking for investments, and looking for raw materials for industry. So Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia and South Asia form part of this new Second Conquest. But in Latin America, I think only in Latin America is that terminology used, because Latin America was already colonized by Europeans in the 1500s, and now it's being recolonized in the 1800s. So the Central American economies are, through foreign investment and foreign immigrants. In Guatemala, it's a lot of German immigrants who take over indigenous land to build the coffee economy, and they bring their technology with them. And in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, the United Fruit Company and the Standard Fruit Company, two big US banana companies, again, they bring their technology, they take over huge amounts of land, and they implement new forced labor systems. So many indigenous people who had escaped the forced labor of Spanish colonialism are now drawn into the forced labor of this Second Conquest. So working on the plantations, whether it's the coffee plantations or the banana plantations, which are in foreign hands, and this is considered by the ruling elites, who are the landed elites of these countries, to be economic development because it makes them rich. And this is also when the countries develop their own militaries and multiple police systems to implement these land takeovers and forced labor systems. So the militaries and police that exist today have their roots in this national consolidation of the late 1800s under foreign control and national consolidation in the hands of elites who are like middlemen and profiteers from this system of foreigners exploiting indigenous and peasant workers by dispossessing them of their land and forcing them into plantation labor. So this is the system that's established at the end of the 1800s, and it really is the cause of the revolutions 100 years later. Although there's yet another step, which is the post-World War II developmental decades and the Cold War, where the United States starts pouring money into yet another wave of export economies. And there's great book called Export Agriculture and the Crisis in Central America that looks at how now just in the hands of the US, because the United States has supplanted Britain and Germany, so it's really just the US by the time of World War II, or the end of World War II, pouring new resources into yet another wave of land dispossession, exploitation, and forced labor in the name of economic development, and even in the name of preventing revolution, this Cold War, we want to make sure that these countries develop under us, promoting cotton, sugar, and beef cattle industries. Again, in the interests of US corporations, but also in the interests of counter-revolution, which has precisely the opposite effect. But because by further concentrating land, by further dispossessing the peasantry, it actually pushes the poor of these countries into revolution.
There you go. There's that concept again, pushing them into revolutions, making it inevitable, essentially where they have no place else to go. One of the places I used to take my students in San Salvador after our trips through El Salvador, we'd end up at the Military History Museum, and it's on a military base there, and it's basically just Quonset hut after Quonset hut of U.S. military weapons that have been sent there by private companies as well as by the U.S. Going back to the 1870s, the first ones that were sent there. And you can see these are the weapons that are being used to put down and keep in line the peasants under this consolidation, especially dedicated to coffee lands in the late 1800s. And going forward, I mean, they stop in the 1980s, the weapons, but it's a whole century's worth of U.S. foreign policy, basically, there. And there are these events that take place. One of them that really strikes me is that in 1934, there's a weapon, there's an M1 Garand that was sent there from the U.S., and this is 2 years after La Matanza in 1932. So it shows kind of what was happening after El Mozote too. There wasn't really a standard that of atrocities that could be exceeded for us to stop sending them weapons. And so in the 1920s and 30s, 40s period, there are these three events that characterize the three major countries. Like you have the Matanza in El Salvador, you have the Marine occupation of Nicaragua and the war against Sandino, and then the 10 years of spring that no Americans know about this. I mean, when we talk about these to our classes, they really don't know about it. But I always think of those as examples of how they tried to do something different, and then the U.S., not so much in the case of the Matanza, although we were present to a degree, but in so many cases we're supporting the oppression of people who are trying these mass movements. And then later on in the 70s and 80s, they try it again, and they're just walloped with even more. Can you talk about those three?
Yeah, and I always like to talk about the 1944 revolution in Guatemala. Again, connected to something I was saying earlier, how like people here seem to feel like, oh, the system is so strong, there's nothing we can do. And yet, in the poorest countries, the most dispossessed people keep finding things that they can do. So were there other potential futures for Central America? Obviously, there were. And, the Guatemala Revolution of 1944 is one example that if the United States had chosen, instead of choosing to use every tool in the kit to undermine and eventually in 1954 overthrow the Guatemalan Revolution and put into place decades of military dictatorship, and genocide against the Guatemalan indigenous population. What if the United States had decided to either keep its hands off and allow the popular movements in Guatemala and the popularly, democratically elected president of Guatemala to try to implement social and economic reforms in their country in the interests of the majority, or even more unbelievably, decided to support this revolutionary experiment in the interests of social justice. What would have happened? We don't know, but certainly by destroying that, we cut off any possibility for progressive social change in Guatemala for decades and caused the horrific deaths and massacres and genocide that happened under our watch. And I think the same thing about the Sandinista Revolution. What if the United States, was the October Revolution in Guatemala perfect? Was everyone involved in it a paragon of virtue? Of course not. Same thing with the Sandinista Revolution. Same thing with the American Revolution and every revolution that's ever happened. But if the United States had decided either to just let Nicaraguans figure out their own future, or even provide support to those Nicaraguans who were trying to build a more just country, the future, Nicaragua's history would have unfolded very differently, and so would Guatemala's. So we can't just look at Central America and say, oh, they keep messing up, they keep doing everything wrong. It's like every time they try to do something differently, we come in and quash it instead of saying, oh, maybe they can figure out solutions to their own problems, and we shouldn't just consider them roadkill in our drive to destroy the planet.
It reminds me, what you're saying too, is that of so many conversations I've had with my students over the past 18 years, which is that once you mention the Guatemala coup in 1954, that even more so than Pinochet in 73 or any of the other number of interventions that we've been involved in, that one really stands out to my students. They just that's a chink in the armor right there for them. And it's hard for anybody to argue against that 10 years of spring that they had, where they just had two democratically elected presidents. With the case, at least with Allende, some people can say, well, he was Marxist and maybe that justified our intervention. And that's a whole other discussion. But with Arbenz and with Arevalo, it's just how do you back something like that up?
I guess I just really resist the idea that, well, he was Marxist, so maybe that justifies. I know you're not trying to justify that either, but I think we have to be really careful about going there and talk instead about respecting sovereignty and autonomy. And if a Latin American government pursues policies that we don't like, they actually have the right to do that. We're not the world's policemen to just enforce what we want everyone to do in our own interests. And, a lot of Latin Americans are Marxists because they think that capitalism has been really bad for them. And they're right, it has.
Sure. And even Western historians have pointed out this kind of thing to explain why they were communist in the wake of World War I in Europe. Saying things, well, what other options do we really have? Because we had seen what imperialism and capitalism had done. And so these alternatives that the Bolsheviks were talking about seemed like something that we could apply in our own countries. And of course, we saw what happened with Stalin, but that doesn't mean that's the only option for a left-leaning socialist type of a program.
And I think people are also really unaware of histories of communism in the United States. Because when I started researching the history of the textile mill in the town I live in now, it was one of the world's largest textile mills from the 1850s to the 1950s. And there was a strong communist labor movement right here in Salem. And the workers at the mill were not little clones of Joseph Stalin. They were workers who felt they were being exploited by their bosses and who wanted better working conditions.
Absolutely. And until people have actually experienced that kind of thing firsthand, and kind of circling back onto El Mozote, the people that I know who joined the ERP, biggest faction of the FMLN, were people who had family members that were killed, not just at El Mozote, but in the surrounding areas. And Many of them had to flee over the border to Colomacagua, and otherwise and they were 5 or 7 years old when it happened, and they had to flee from the military. So obviously they're going to have some type of a pushback on the traditional system, which has led to their plight, and try and have some type of change.
I think another thing that people were aware of maybe in the 1980s, people in the United States, but has also kind of gone down the memory hole, was the role of the Catholic Church.
Oh, yeah.
And the revolutionary liberation theology of the Catholic Church, which called upon poor people to fight for social justice in this world. And that it was God's will to create the kingdom of heaven here. And creating the kingdom of heaven meant overturning capitalism. So, you have Marxist priests in Latin America. And again, I think that instead of just seeing the term Marxist as meaning something like cruel and evil, we need to understand the different ways that Marxist thought has informed movements for social change.
Right, ignited people's action or imagination, so they can think of a different world, and so they can try and implement something different. It's unfortunate because we still see it in our modern day politics too. I mean, I was speaking to a group of Vietnam veterans the other day who labeled Biden as a communist because of the vaccine mandate, and so it's becoming. I thought it was gone, 30 years ago, but it keeps on coming up. Unfortunately.
Well, I read, as I was saying, I read the paper every day. One of the phrases that I'm most annoyed about that has to be in the newspaper every single day is something about authoritarian China, communism, and their zero COVID policy. And they're just so evil for having the zero COVID policy. And I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not going to opine about the best way of dealing with a pandemic, because obviously we've done a lot of things wrong in this pandemic too. But the idea that communism, Marxism, China, zero COVID, authoritarian, it's can't we talk rationally about, do you just have to repeat those catchphrases as this way of telling us, oh, you're supposed to think China's bad?
I agree, absolutely. Especially if you look at opinion polls in China, and the people are just about as happy as people are over here. It's not this widespread oppression that everybody senses that would be beyond what we would experience here too. And likewise in places like Central America too, where this is a problem. I don't know if you find this, but when you teach the history of Central America, and there's a lot of oppression that's involved in that history, that people don't necessarily always see the kind of the happiness that's there too, the culture that exists, the day-to-day life, which is much more about relationships than it is in most places in the United States. Could you talk about some of your experiences with that?
Well, before I do that, let me just say something else that you were making me think of, that I feel like young people today are actually quite critical of capitalism. That is, maybe 20 or 30 years ago when I first started teaching, I used to say, you only know capitalism in the United States. And here in the United States, capitalism seems to be working really well. We have all this stuff, we have great this, we have great that, but go to Haiti and look at how well capitalism is working there. The reason that we're doing so well isn't just because of capitalism. It's also because with 6% of the world's population, we use 50% of the world's resources, and capitalism allows us to do that, but that's not necessarily a good thing. But I feel like there's kind of more of a critical consciousness about capitalism now among our students. They're heavily indebted. They don't really see a secure financial future for themselves under capitalism. They see that capitalism is destroying the planet. So I think that there's some space for critical consciousness about capitalism that kind of didn't exist as much a couple of decades ago. I don't know if you see that too.
I completely agree. I've been wondering about this the past few years, why this is taking place. But when I started teaching in 2003, we just invaded Iraq, and patriotism was at its height. And so if you brought up a criticism of capitalism, it was like bringing up a criticism of the U.S. And over time, as people have kind of seen that the wars weren't a good idea, and all, the financial crisis and COVID and Trump, that you're right, that if you bring up capitalism, then they're much more willing to kind of see it from a critical perspective. Plus, where I live in West Virginia, there is this consciousness about the role of coal and timber companies as being exploitative. Yeah. And I grew up in the Bay Area, and so that's something that I really notice here is how different people talk about corporations here. On the one hand, they're the source of jobs, and everybody has somebody who's worked in the coal industry before. And so you don't want to criticize coal necessarily. But on the other hand, people recognize the exploitative nature of that. They can understand what Guatemala and Honduras have gone through from that perspective.
And where I'm doing a lot of my work now is actually in northern Colombia, in the coal mining region there. And it's the same kind of conflict. Of course, there it's a foreign company. And the social protections that people have, it's a primarily indigenous and Afro-Colombian region of extremely poor and marginalized people. And most of them do not work in the mine because this is an open pit mine. And so the two main job categories are heavy machinery operator and heavy machinery repair. They require a high level of literacy and skills training that most of the people in the region, which has a 65% illiteracy rate, don't have. And people see their livelihoods being destroyed by the mine, their land, their water, their air, their survival, their food sovereignty being destroyed, and yet they also see the mine as their only salvation, their only hope to get access to things like schools and healthcare, because the government has never had a social welfare presence. It's had a military presence, but not a social welfare presence in that area. And people also understand that if the mine were just to close up and leave, that would be the most disastrous thing of all. Like, it's done all this damage. It's also employed thousands of people. And it's in some ways brought development to the region. So it's really complicated.
Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking of a book called Deaths of Despair, which really looks at places like Appalachia in rural America in general, where when the companies came in, they raised the standard of living, but then when they leave, then you leave behind basically suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, and that those deaths, which aren't microbe based, right? They're not infectious diseases. They're just as deadly, and the social fabric ends up being completely disrupted. How do you get that back? Is such a difficult question. And the Central American people, now to kind of turn it around to the end topic of your book, which is about Central American immigration coming up to the United States. It seems like that's really their only other option, is that, well, they could come up to Mexico, maybe work there, but that's not going to be the best option. And so they go through Mexico up to the U.S. to have some type of an economic option, even though this started with the war, right? They started leaving because they're fleeing violence, but now there's been this continuous stream of people, and now they're leaving because of violence and economic problems. Can you go into detail about some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's two ways in which the wars really led directly to today's migration. One is by violently disrupting rural life, destroying communities, destroying land, uprooting people fleeing to the cities, communities being destroyed. So this massive population upheaval that destroyed the fabric of rural life that you were talking about a little while ago, a couple minutes ago, when I changed the subject and never answered your question.
Oh, that's fine.
And the other way is that by destroying the left, by destroying the revolutionary movements, the United States opened the floodgates to full-fledged neoliberal reform. And that's like the fourth conquest of Central America. So, and that has taken place in Nicaragua as much as in El Salvador and Guatemala and even Costa Rica. So the tattered remains of the social welfare state being destroyed, the free trade agreements, this huge influx of US investment now in things like the maquiladora industries, which have taken over Central America, new export crops, what they call non-traditional exports, palm oil to help us have greener gasoline in the United States, what they call biofuels or agrofuels. So the removal of the last vestiges of state support for workers, for the natural environment, for the poor, for small farmers, have really, it took the wars to destroy the social movements that were opposing this, and then the floodgates were just opened. So the degree of economic despair and dispossession, again, it's like a quantum leap since the end of the wars. So we have even more people fleeing now than we did during the wars. But the wars, I think, really set the groundwork for what's happening now. They also laid the groundwork in terms of chain migration, because, and this is a phenomenon, Trump tried to kind of demonize chain migration, but chain migration has been going on as long as we've been able to record history. That is, when one person from a family or extended family or community migrates, that opens the possibility for other people to migrate, because they send back remittances, they send back news, people know somebody in the place where they're going to, they can tell them if there's jobs. This is something that's been going on for centuries. So the refugee generation also laid the groundwork for subsequent generations to follow them.
And that's a whole other aspect that would take a long time to go into. And you explain a lot in your other books and Undocumented about the refugee or immigrant life in the United States too. But the kind of to finish this off, what kinds of policy changes do you think would be? I mean, I know you as a historian, it's hard to say, well, what should you do in the future? But I know you have some ideas about some of the flaws in our immigration policy. What kinds of changes would you think would improve the situation?
Well, I do definitely think we need to change our immigration policies, but also, the situation is bigger than our immigration policies. It's also the policies that we're imposing on Central America that are forcing people to migrate. So, Biden talked a lot back in the days when Biden and Harris were talking about immigration. Now they're not anymore, but back in the days when they talked about addressing the root causes of migration. But they never identified what are actually the root causes of migration. But I think we do need to think about the root causes of migration, which are things like the Central America Free Trade Agreement, like the ways that neoliberal structural adjustment policies forced on Central American countries by international financial institutions, debt. So, really fundamentally rethinking our economic relationship with Central America, I think would be one basis to looking at the root causes, not pouring more money into policing and military and promoting foreign investment in Central America, but letting Central American governments actually implement policies to create more equal and more just and more democratic countries. But in terms of immigration policy per se, obviously the punitive criminalization of immigrants that has been a Democratic as much as a Republican set of policies, at least since the 1990s, has not stopped migration. It's only served to make migrants more exploitable and create huge amounts of human suffering, both in Central America, on the border, and among immigrants in the United States. So treating immigrant rights as human rights and eliminating this issue of status that gives some people rights and other people not rights, and just following the basic tenet that everybody has rights. Everybody has rights. Doesn't matter where you're born, you still have rights. I think has to be the basis of our immigration policy. And that means very concretely and specifically rolling back one by one the policies that have been put into place over the last 30 years to criminalize and oppress immigrants.
That's very well said, and I would encourage listeners to read Undocumented, as well as They Take Our Jobs, and then Central America's Forgotten History, to get a much deeper and more detailed sense of the kinds of the ins and outs of why people immigrate to the United States, and how people are distinguished between legal and illegal, to how these are kind of invented terms by humans, as you point out. And that also means that these laws can be changed. And in fact, there are people like Milton Friedman even was in favor of open borders. And so this is not something that necessarily has to be a left-wing or a right-wing thing, but the way that the narrative has been shaped for a long time. I'm thinking going back to like Governor Duke Majan's campaign in California, and so much of the other discussions that have taken place in the past 3 decades, as you say, then they're just very flawed, and they're not helping people. People dying in the desert in Arizona by the thousands over this period of time. This is as a result of these higher levels of restrictions, and they're just not helping to stem the flow, and it's also not helping the people on either side of the border. Well, I really appreciate you talking to us today, Dr. Aviva Chomsky, and I really look forward to reading your future work as well. If anybody out there is interested in giving us a review, please do so. And we'll talk to you guys another time. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much.